So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ellie Arnold, the training coordinator at Stem Cell Network. And I'd like to welcome and thank you for joining us for this webinar, which is the pre and post award financial management webinar hosted by Stem Cell Network. For anyone who might not be familiar with Stem Cell Network, we're a national non-for-profit organization that supports three main objectives: stem cell and regenerative medicine research, training the next generation of highly qualified personnel, and supporting the knowledge mobilization and transfer of stem cell and regenerative medicine research. This webinar was initiated from a desire to address topics that are particularly relevant to SCN's early career researcher community. Our ongoing support for early career researchers, or what we call ECRs, who are individuals who are within the first 5 years of independent academic appointments, is a crucial activity that is building the next generation of innovative scientists in regenerative medicine. Through consultation with ECRs in our community, we've heard that investigators don't just need expertise in research, but they also need expertise in areas like project management, finance, HR, grantsmanship, and a huge list of other skills that are required for a successful research career. And this webinar today will present strategies to build budgets, track spending, and manage lab finances. This webinar has been developed by finance experts at the Grant Management Office at the Hospital for Sick Children, Priscilla Mack and Sarah Ahadi. And I think they've done a fantastic job of developing content that will be applicable not just for ECRs, but for researchers at any stage. I also want to encourage you to keep an eye out for other ECR specific initiatives at SCN. We launched the ECR committee in January of this year, and they've been busy planning the SCN ECR Symposium, which will be in Montreal in May. And you can go on our website and find the save the date and sign up to be notified when registration officially opens later this month. And the ACR committee will be assisting in developing other professional development opportunities throughout the year. So keep an eye out for those as well by signing up for our newsletter. A couple of just quick housekeeping notes before we get started. Sarah and Priscilla will talk for about 45 minutes, and so we'll have about 10 or 15 minutes at the end to take questions, and please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit questions. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on Stem Cell Network's YouTube channel. And Sarah and Priscilla have shared their slides and some resources with attendees. This was in your reminder email that you got just an hour ago, and I'll drop it in the chat once I finish speaking. So with that, thank you again for being here today, and I'll pass it over to Sarah and Priscilla to get started. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellie, for that warm introduction. So as mentioned, my name is Sarah Ashley. I am the manager of the grant applications team, and I'll be going through most of the pre-award sections of this workshop, and then I'll hand it over to my colleague, Priscilla Mack, who's the manager in the post-award services. I did want to take the opportunity to just thank Stem Cell Network and Ellie and the entire team on behalf of Sick Kids for inviting us to put this workshop together. We hope you find it beneficial. So to start off, we'd like to acknowledge the land that we are meeting on. It's the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and we acknowledge that it's now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are all treaty peoples. So as Ellie mentioned, we have developed this presentation, and we are from Sick Kids Research Institute, but we do understand that a lot of the investigators attending this session vary from the institutions that they are from. So just one disclaimer that we wanted to make everybody aware of is to make sure that you are in touch with your institution's grants office when preparing your application and when you're setting up and actually managing any research funds. And this is to ensure that all the institutional policies are being followed. Sometimes there are differences between institutions, and we've tried to make this presentation more general, but just a disclaimer there that it is good to follow up with your institution, their grants office, so you can work together as a team on any of the budgets that you're applying for and then managing as well once awarded. So this here is an overview of the topics that we will go through. So I will take care of the first half, starting from the grant life cycle, considerations for grant agency budgets, designing a research project budget, preparing a budget justification, and then we'll get into two specific research budget templates from two funders. And then I will hand it off to Priscilla, who will go through the second part of the session, which includes the project setup, financial award management, tracking a research budget, forecasting and burn rate calculation, and finally project closeout. So to start off, this is a very simplified overview of a grant life cycle. And the first step on the cycle you can see at the top there is finding funding opportunities. The key thing here is you want to make sure that the funding opportunity that you are looking for and that you are applying for, it matches your research needs. So depending on the stage of your research, if you are on the beginning stages, you might be looking for smaller grants within the $25,000 to $50,000 range. Or if you are more farther along in your research, you may want to look for larger grants with larger budget amounts for longer periods of time, and then prepare the application for those. And another key thing to be mindful of when you are looking for funding opportunities is any of the eligibility criteria. So there are many opportunities catered and only open to early career investigators. So it's something to be mindful of if you do want to target those opportunities. And once you've found an opportunity that does align with your research, the next step would be to prepare and develop the proposal and actually submit the proposal for the application. And the key component of the application is the budget itself, which I will go through in the upcoming slide. And the third item on this life cycle is the award notification. So fingers crossed, once the application is submitted, you do receive the funding. And a key thing there is to be mindful of any terms and conditions that are outlined in the award document before you actually start spending, because there may be certain things that you may need to do beforehand and then actually start spending the grant funding. And the last three items on the grant life cycle there, the project startup, the award management, and the award closeout, those items Priscilla will go into in more detail in her slides. So this slide here just goes through some general principles to keep in mind when you are preparing any granting agency budgets. So the first thing is to make sure that the costs are reasonable. So you want to make sure that they are appropriate and the costs are not overly inflated. You want to make sure that the costs are consistent. So the same charges are being made to different agencies. So whether you are submitting a budget to a federal funder or a smaller nonprofit, for example, the charges that you are putting on there, whether they are salary charges, materials, and supplies, they should be consistent between the agencies. And the third item there is the allocability. So any goods and services that are being added to the budget, they should be assigned directly to the project itself. So whether this is at the application stage or when you're actually charging the funds, once awarded, any of the costs should be related to the project. So personnel that are being charged to the project, they should be working on that grant itself. And the last item there is related to compliance. So this is specific to the agency guidelines, especially related to the eligible and ineligible costs. And this is also extended to your institutional guidelines as well. If there are certain policies or processes in place related to what should be or shouldn't be included in the budget, you want to make sure that you are compliant both with the agency and the institution. And the next slide here is going again through other considerations to keep in mind when you are developing your budget. So the first item there is the foreign exchange. So you want to make sure that you are using the currency that the funder is in. And a key thing is to make sure that you are using a consistent source for the exchange rate. So one of the recommendations that we have at SIGKIDS is to use the Bank of Canada exchange rate. And another recommendation that we give our investigators is to add a buffer. So just a 2% buffer to account for fluctuations. Again, this 2% buffer, it's not overly inflating the cost. So it's consistent with what was mentioned in the previous slide, that you want to make sure it's reasonable, it's appropriate. And by consistently adding this buffer to any of the any time you are exchanging the currency for any of your funders that are not in Canadian dollars, then it's fine to do so as long as you have that consistency. And the next item here is related to matching funds. So this includes any funds that are from sources other than the funder that you are applying to. So it can include hard cash or it can include in-kind contributions. And there are a lot of details related to the requirements from the agency and the eligibility of the matching funds. So you do want to make sure that you are taking a look at the agency guidelines, paying close attention there, In some cases, there may be certain funds that cannot be used as a match. Some agencies do require a match, whereas others, for Stem Cell Network, for example, one of their competitions, the Impact Grant, although not required, this was something that was included in the guidelines, and any in-kind or cash contributions did result in a higher ranking of the application during review. So it could potentially make your application more competitive to other individuals if you are able to show any matching funds. Another key thing when you are including any matching funds in your budget is to make sure that the amount of the matching funds and the period of funds do match up with the actual award when it's actually funded to you. So a lot of times we don't, once an application is submitted, the award period, it doesn't start maybe until a few months or a year from the date of submission. So you want to make sure that once the award starts, the matching funds that you promised in the application, they will still be available, and that time period does overlap as well. And the third item on here, just to be mindful of whether the budget is capped or open. So if there is a budget cap, you want to make sure that you are not going over that budget cap, but you do want to double check the guidelines. In some cases, the agencies do allow for prior approval to be obtained in order to go over the cap. So for example, the National Institutes of Health, which is a big research funder of health research in the United States, they do allow for some of their funding opportunities. They allow investigators to go over the cap, but prior approval from the agency does need to be obtained. And the next item on here is making sure that you have a balance between a competitive versus a doable budget. So if you do have access to any discounted rates for the project costs, perhaps at your institution, there's access to 4 facilities that offer discounted rates, or within your department, there may be a piece of equipment that you do have access to, or collaborators that may have access to discounted rates for certain services or project costs. That's something that you can include within your budget and the justification to show that your budget and application is more competitive than others. But you do want to make sure that the feasibility of the project is not sacrificed. So again, it's that balance, that making sure all of the costs of the project are included, but showing that you're able to carry out the project at a competitive rate compared to other investigators. And the last item on here is budget cuts. So the key thing here is just to be mindful that budget cuts do happen. So just to plan ahead and really think about the feasibility of the project. So for some agencies, they are well known for the budget cuts. The Canadian Institutes of Health Research, CIHR, for example, they are known for giving about a 25% budget cut for their project competition, something that they are hoping to get rid of, but something that will be happening for the upcoming competition in March, for example. So something to be mindful of as you are preparing that application, if it is padding the budget a bit, but not overly inflating it. So again, making sure it is reasonable, but also considering perhaps if you do get that budget cut, are there other funding opportunities that you can apply for that can make up for the budget cut? Now, this slide here goes through some of the key budget categories that we see when investigators do design their research project budget. So the first one at the top there is the personnel costs. So this includes all of the salary and the benefit costs for all personnel included in your budget. And you should also include any annual increases, so cost of living increases, if the funder does allow this. And the key thing here is you do want to make sure that the correct salary ranges are being used. So if you do have trainees on your project who will be working on the project, making sure that the correct rates from the university are being used. If there will be research staff on the project, you want to make sure that the actual salaries are being used, or for those individuals who are those roles who are not hired for yet, making sure that you're in touch with your HR department or the grants office to ensure that the correct salary wages are being used. And the next item there is the travel and publication costs. So this is something that you want to make sure is being included and that it does follow the agency's guidelines. So some agencies, they have specific rules regarding what type of travel can be included. So for example, the Stem Cell Network, the impact competition, there was a limit of $10,000 that could be used for that for the entire duration of the project for any meeting related costs. And for some agencies, they do have specific requirements of using US airlines, for example, especially for the US federal funders. And other agencies, they do have a per diem rate. So for example, they have an allotment of what the maximum amount can be used for the meal charges or the hotel charges or even transportation charges. So paying close attention to that. Excuse me. And generally what we see for the travel cost is about $1,500 per person per conference. And that is for the domestic conference. So if you do have international conferences, the rates would be higher. And the next item on here is the subcontract cost. So if there are any co-investigators on your project where there will be costs associated with the project itself, making sure that, again, you're going back to the agency guidelines. Sometimes they do require specific budget, separate budget templates for all subsites. And then there's a separate lead, a separate budget for the lead site itself. And then the next item there is the materials and supplies. So this is really subject to the proposed research. Depending on the research itself, this could include general lab supplies. We have seen some investigators indicate, allocate a specific funding amount per FTE on the project. So for example, $1,500 or $2,000 per FTE per year, that's the project will be ongoing for, and then giving a brief description of what the material includes. So if it's lab reagents, common pipettes, test tubes, etc. But regardless, you want to make sure that you are justifying what the materials and supplies is for and providing that breakdown, especially if these costs will be higher. And the next item on there is any service costs. So if you do have any services on your related to your project, you want to make sure that you are providing a detailed breakdown of these services. And the equipment costs is another big item as well. It's very important to be mindful of the agency and how they define this. In general, a piece of equipment is any non-expendable tangible property which has a useful life of more than 1 year and that surpasses a certain budget threshold. So depending on the funder, they define the threshold a little differently. So the Tri-Agency Guide on Financial Administration, which is the guide that CIHR and Stem Cell Network follow, their threshold is $2,000, whereas the National Institutes of Health in the US, their threshold is $5,000. So you can imagine an iMac or a piece of a laptop, for example. If you are preparing a budget for the Stem Cell Network, for example, you may need to list that as a piece of equipment if it is over that $2,000 range. Whereas for the NIH, which has that $5,000 threshold, you may need to categorize that piece of laptop as a material and supply. And the last item on there is related to the indirect costs. So all of the other categories that I've mentioned, they are related to the direct costs of research, whereas indirect costs, they are not directly attributed to your research project, but they do need to be covered by the institution for you to carry out your research. So these can include costs of building costs, utilities, the research operations staff, so the legal department, grants office, the agreements department within your institution. And in general, institutions do require that indirect costs be included within the budget. But a key thing is to remember to check the agency guidelines, what rate is allowed, whether indirect costs are allowed, and also whether indirect costs are included within a budget cap, if there is a budget cap, or it can be included on top of the budget cap. So some Canadian funders, they do not allow indirect costs. So Stem Cell Network, CIHR, for example, they do not allow indirect costs within the budget. But some of the other funders, such as NIH, they do allow the indirect costs to be included in the budget. And now going into the budget justification. So this is a big part of the application as well. You want to make sure that you are giving a detailed breakdown of all of the costs that are included in the budget. So in explaining any institutional requirements. So if it is related to the salary, or if your institution has specific requirements about what benefit rates to be used or the salary wages that need to be included, you can explain that within the budget justification, just to explain to the funder that there is a rationale and there was thought into why you have added the dollar amounts that were in the budget itself. And the next item there is proving the necessity of cost. So you do want to relate it back to the project, even going into as much detail of relating it back to the objectives of the project or the specific aims of the project. In some cases, we have seen that certain personnel that have been included in the budget, there may be one or two individuals working on the first year of a project and then another individual working on the last year of the project for an aim that is later on in the project. So explaining that rationale of why the individuals are being hired for each of the different aims, showing that they have the correct expertise, for example, and even proving the necessity of some of those service costs, or if you've got animal costs, some of the mice costs, for example, they can really add up. So really providing that breakdown of the cage costs and how you come to the final dollar amount for each of those budget categories. And the equipment justification is another key thing to be mindful of. We have anecdotally heard from reviewers that this is not something that reviewers like to see in an operating grant budget, but if it is allowed by the funder, then a key thing is just to show that the piece of equipment is necessary for the research to take place. So you do want to provide that rationale within the justification. And if you do have any quotes associated with the piece of equipment, you can also obtain those before preparing the budget, just for internal purposes. And this relates to the next point there, the supporting documentation. It's really, the quotes are really meant not to submit with the application, but just so that you've done your homework to see what the actual cost will likely be if awarded. And the other supporting documentation that you can include within your application is any letters of support. So if you do have any of the access to discounted rates from perhaps a collaborator or a co-investigator that has access to certain services or core facilities, you can provide a letter of support showing that. And letters of support are usually required for any of those matching funds. So any partners that are providing those cash or in-kind contributions, a signed letter of support from the individual should be included along with the application. And another thing to consider with the budget justification is making sure that the budget breakdown with the dollar amounts is consistent with the justification itself. So in some cases, depending on the agency, you will provide a Word document with the budget justification included, or in other cases, it might be a copy and text into a field within an online portal. But in cases when you are providing or developing the budget justification from scratch, you do want to make sure that you are following the correct categories from the agency and the correct order of categories as well. It just makes it a lot easier for reviewers to review the budget justification when they're comparing it to the breakdown of the dollar amounts. Another key thing to be mindful of, again, when you're preparing a justification in a Word document, is making sure to use headings and white spaces. So you can see on the right-hand example, this is what not to do. So there aren't any headers clearly shown here, and the use of white space is very minimal. Whereas on the right-hand side, you can see that there are specific subheadings used, and the use of white space is used throughout the justification. And then the last item that I will go through is just the research budget template. So the key thing here is to make sure that you are using the funder's template and their guidelines. So we have noticed that a lot of funders, they are moving to online portals. So having the budget document and the budget breakdown entered within different fields within the online portals. You want to make sure that you are working ahead of the deadline to make sure you've got the online account set up, you are familiar with the budget breakdown and preparing your budget accordingly. And this is an example from the stem cell network from the impact competition earlier this year. You can see that there are different categories used. So there's the personnel costs and then the non-personnel costs, which does include equipment, consumables, and services. And you can see the different use of terms there. So the term consumables being used instead of materials and supplies. So again, making sure when you're preparing your justification that you're using consistent terminology that the funder is using. And you can see at the top as well that there is period 1 and period 2. So this refers to the year of the grant. So some funders, they do require a breakdown by year. So you do want to make sure that you are including the annual cost. But for some agencies and some competitions, that's not the case. They just require the overall budget for the entire project broken down by categories, not by year. So you do want to be mindful of this when you are preparing your budget and make sure that you are entering the correct items. We've had investigators prepare the budget thinking that it was an annual budget being included for a 5-year project. And that's really, could be very detrimental if awarded because they've missed out on most of the project costs. So you want to make sure that you're mindful. Is it an annual breakdown? Is it a total breakdown for the entire duration of the grant? And the second example here is from the CIHR. So this here, you can see the categories listed does vary a little bit from the previous funder. So we've got the research staff, the research trainees, and then also here the materials and supplies. They've really broken it down even further with animals, expendables, and services, any of the travel costs as well. And another key thing to point out here is with the CIHR template, they specifically have columns for the cash and the in-kind contributions. So it's built within the budget, the main budget document itself. Whereas with the stem cell network, that was not included in the main budget, but there's actually a second tab within the application to include any of those matching funds. So again, being mindful of what the categories are and making sure that the templates are filled out correctly. And I'll pass it off to my colleague, Priscilla.
Great, thank you, Sarah. We will now be moving on to discussing the financial management of your project once it's been awarded, what could be referred to as the post-award management. An important step is the setup of your research project or award. We do recommend tracking each research project separately so that you can track the revenues or the funds and the expenses for each corresponding project. This is especially important when you have multiple projects from various funders ongoing at the same time. Now, depending on your institution's financial system or process, they may set up each awarded project separately and assign it a unique identifier. This unique identifier could be called a fund number, a cost number, or even a project number or ID. They would also note in their system the awarded amount as well as the start and end date of your award. This individual project setup will help you moving forward with managing your research project's finances, with financial reporting, as well as with future planning and forecasting. So once your project has been set up in your financial system and the awarded funds are allocated, you will then be able to start spending and incurring the expenses. This could include hiring personnel if applicable, allocating your employees and their related costs to your new project, procurement, or even informing any of your institution's facilities or internal departments that you'll be using where they can charge their costs and services to. Now that you have been awarded the funds and are spending it down, you will be responsible for managing your finances. So what is involved in financial management? Financial management involves being mindful of the various processes and policies in place, both at the institutional level and at the agency level. So the first being procurement. Procurement is the action of obtaining something such as goods or services. So in addition to deciding what you need or want to purchase, you need to ensure that your institutional policies are being followed as well. For example, depending on the dollar amount of the item or service you are procuring, your institution may have a policy wherein you need to go through a competitive process in order to obtain a vendor for that item or that service. Secondly, while incurring expenses, you should also ensure that you are approving and tracking those costs. This is especially important if you've delegated the task to other members within your lab. You want to make sure that your lab is ordering items that are actually needed for your research, but also that no duplicate orders of supplies are being put through by various members. Note, your institution may have a policy as well in which there is a process or a workflow involved for requisitioning and approving a purchase based on the dollar value. You need to keep this in mind as it may affect the time it will take before the order is put through, it's shipped, and then available for you to use it for your research. You also want to be cognizant of your commitments as well. For example, if you are hiring new personnel or on a contract basis for a year, you want to ensure that you have funds available for your commitment with them. As Sarah had mentioned, compliance is key to ensure that you are complying not only to your institutional policies, but also that of the agency that has funded your research. This compliance could include the time period in which the funds should be spent, what are the funds designated for or the expenses to be covered, including what is eligible or non-eligible, and the reporting requirements of the agency.
While managing your funds, it is also important to plan and forecast in order for you to be aware of how long the funds will last and what the expenses are that you're expecting for the future. We will be discussing forecasting and calculating your spending rate a little later in the presentation. And finally, there is the financial reporting that is typically required by the various agencies and funders. Because of your due diligence and responsibility, you need to report back to them on how their funds have been spent. And this requirement could be on a quarterly or an annual basis. Similarly to the budget templates, some agencies and funders will have their own reporting templates that need to be completed. Because of moving online as well, they will have their own portals where you'll need to submit these reports as well.
So moving on, so in addition to the financial management I had discussed earlier, some of your responsibilities in managing your research award or project could include reviewing and monitoring your finances on a monthly basis and identifying any discrepancies. So for example, you want to ensure that the expenses have been charged to your project correctly, and if needed, working with your grant office to make any corrections as soon as possible. You will also be responsible for preparing and submitting your research progress reports as well to the agency. Now, depending on your institution's process, you may need to prepare or even approve the financial statements that your grants office has prepared and provide any variance explanations that may be required by the funder. It is important to submit those progress reports and the financial statements in a timely manner because sometimes the agencies require those to be submitted before they release the next payment or installment of your award. And lastly, you will be responsible and involved in requesting of no-cost extensions if needed. This is important if you have, if the time period of your award has ended, but you have funds still available for you to continue spending. So you want to get that no-cost extension from the agency to allow you to continue spending that money. Okay. So as you can see, a lot of the financial management involves tracking and keeping an idea of your finances and keeping track of the spending. So it's important to keep track of your spending against the award that was approved or the research budget that was approved by the agency, so that you can also monitor and plan out what you have remaining to spend in comparison to what was awarded. So how does one keep track of the awarded budget or funds? Okay. Hopefully you can all see the screen. All right. So how do you keep track of your budget? Well, first you'd have to review your actual spending. Now, depending on your institution's financial system, they would be able to keep track of this actual expenditures incurred on the project. Your finance team or your grants management office should be able to provide you with a financial report or even access to a reporting tool that allows you to visually see and view your related expenses that have been recorded in their financial system. Next, you want to look at your monthly and year-to-date totals of expenses that you've incurred. This could also include your life-to-date totals, especially if your award covers several years. Now that you have your actual spending and your year-to-date totals, you can compare your totals to what the project budget is. By comparing your year-to-date spending with the budget, you can then see what is the remaining balance that you have available. If you've been tracking it, you can also view it by budget category, so you can see by budget category what you have available to spend. Now, the next few steps I will be discussing will relate to helping you with financial planning. And that would be determining the number of months remaining in order for you to complete the project. By understanding how many more months you have available to, or you need to complete the project, you could then estimate the total, the remaining expenses that you need to incur. By having a total estimated total for project completion, you can compare that to your budget of the award. And by comparing it, you can then make the necessary decisions of what you need to adjust so that you are aligned and adhere to the budget that was awarded to you. Now, your institution may already have a financial system that tracks the award and the expenses related to that award. But if not, in order to assist you, we have provided you with an Excel template of a track sheet that may be helpful for you to use. So let's look at an example that I have on screen. So here we received an award of $80,000 for 1 year. The agency or the funder has approved how that money is to be spent by different expense categories. So we have salaries of $35,000, annual cost of $10,000, or even supplies of $22,500. As we start incurring expenses on this project,
I've been tracking my expenses on a monthly basis. So here we've tracked from January, February, and March. I've been tracking my actual expenditures, and right now I'm in the middle of April. And so these are the expenses I'm aware of. So now by comparing my actual spending against the budget awarded, you can see here that we have spent a total of $35,175 of that $80,000, leaving us with $44,825 available to spend. Now, looking at the various expense categories, we can see what's available for us to use moving forward. So I have $16,700 in personnel costs, or even $15,400 for supplies. Now, I mentioned that for steps of financial planning, let's say we estimate that we need another 5 more months to work on this project. We can then plan out what we are expected to spend over those months. Well, I have my personnel that are working on my lab. So for those, I have a commitment to them, and so their costs will continue on for the next 5 months. I can also estimate the number of supplies, my travel costs, or any other costs as well. We then compare our estimated total cost to completion of the project to the budget. So right now I am estimating of spending $80,750, which is an overspend of $750 to the $80,000 award. I will need to adjust my spending so that we are aligned to the budget. We can also take a look at the various expense categories right now to see what we are aligned to what was approved by the agency. Here we can see that we are estimating to be overspent in the salaries and underspent in the other categories. Now, depending on the agency, you may need to review their guidelines and terms to confirm if there are any restrictions to over or underspending in various categories. Some may require you to request a revision to the budget in your justification and explanation as to why, and also getting the approval for the revised budget variances so that you can continue spending. Now, if you aren't able to plan out your future expenses for the future months and you don't know where to start, another option to help you is to project or forecast your future research finances based on historical information. So what is forecasting? Well, a financial forecast is a process of projecting your future financial position based on your current and expected revenues and expenses. In order for you to forecast, you need to determine what your spending rate is, or what is also known as your burn rate. This is the amount of funds you would typically spend monthly. Because expenses vary monthly, you should use an average of a few prior months of actual spending in order to determine what your burn rate is. And you would pick the number of months based on what you feel is more aligned with how you're planning to spend in the future. So this could be the last 12 months, the last 6 months, or even the last 3 months. Now, to prepare a forecast, you would need to identify the funding project period and the total available funds. You would calculate how much monthly revenue is for that project. And then based on your prior months, you would have calculated what our average monthly expenditures are based on the number of months that we wanted to use, which is the best reflection of how we are going to spend moving forward. And then you would adjust your forecast for any upcoming expected costs moving forward. So let's take a look at our previous example. So we received an award of $80,000 for 1 year. If we calculated that and split that over 12 months, that is revenue or funds of $6,666 per month. Now, as you saw in my track sheet, I was tracking what my monthly expenditures were between January to April. And my expenditures were varied monthly. So if we calculate what my spending or burn rate is based on the last 3 months, which would be January to March, I am spending on average about $9,925. So if we compare the total funds that we received versus the amount of what I'm spending, we can see that I am spending more than the funds that we are receiving. So we can expect that I'm going to run out of my money sooner than the 1 year it was slated for. And how do we determine this? Well, if you take the total award amount of $80,000 and we divide it by our monthly average spending rate, which is $9,925, I get that my total funds will last me 8 months. So right now I'm in the middle of April. So that is just another 5 more months of funding I have available that will take me to August. Now, using the track sheet, the expense track sheet, you can also use it to help you with forecasting. So using the example of the forecasting that I have plugged in the spending that I have incurred for January, February, and March. And I've plugged in what my average burn rate is for April to onwards, which we had calculated as $9,925. By plugging in what I'm forecasted to spend on a monthly basis based on my last 3 months average, we can see that my funds are going to run out by end of August with only $600 available for me to spend. Based on our forecast and our estimating and seeing how our funds are going to be spent in the future periods, we can then make plans and decisions as to what we would like to do. For example, if I need to have the funds available for me longer than up to August, I need to make decisions as to what expenses I need to reduce. Maybe I need to stop, purchasing certain supplies. Maybe I need to revamp my research in order to extend my funds for a longer period of time. Knowing that my expenses, maybe I can't make any adjustments or changes, and knowing that my funds are going to end come August, I then also need to make decisions as to where I need to move my personnel, or even their end dates based on my commitment to them. You also want to make decisions and review what other types of expenses or work is needed to wrap up or close out your project. Okay. And that leads us to the final phase of the grant lifecycle. So when a research project is completed and the funds have been fully spent, it is recommended that the cost center or the project ID number that's been assigned be closed in your financial system. Now, we understand that closing of a project may take time based on the various processes or the procedures at your institution, but we do recommend trying to close out your project within 4 to 6 months in order to avoid expenses from continuing to be incurred on a project for which there are no longer funds to support it. If there is any overspending, you will also need to clear that overspending and, if applicable, move those expenses to other projects or maybe find other funding to support and cover it. So how can you assist your grants office with the project closeout process? Well, this would include maybe moving out your employees that you've allocated to this project, letting your grants office know where they need to be moved to. You can also help with canceling and redirecting any of your reoccurring services or payments to another project or another funds that you have available. But also, you want to inform your team to stop purchasing or requisitioning from that particular project because you don't have any more funds available to support it. And finally, to close out your project, don't forget you need to submit those final progress and financial reports to your funder or agency. So that concludes the end of our presentation. So what resources are available to you once you return back to your institution and you're working on your research projects? Well, we do recommend that you reach out to your institution's grants management office. You also review your institution's policies and procedures so that you're familiar with how things are done. You can also review your funding agency's policies and guidelines, and typically these are available on their website as well. You will have copies of the presentation slides as well, and there will be, since the presentation is being recorded, a link will be forwarded to you later on with the recording. And to assist you, there are the Excel templates that are available for either tracking the expenses or forecasting if your financial system is not able to help you with that. All right. So I believe the remainder of the presentation, we will be able to address any questions that have been put into the chat box or the Q&A forum.
Perfect. So thank you so much, Sarah and Priscilla, for a great talk. I'm sorry for the attendees with the audio issues in the middle. I think we saved it, so it was hopefully mostly okay, and then hopefully it comes through well in the recording as well. So thank you again to Sarah and Priscilla. And as Priscilla said, we can now take a few questions through the Q&A chat box if there are any. I am just going to turn on Sarah's video, and then also Priscilla, if you want to stop sharing your slides, then we can just have our videos up. Perfect. So I'm just trying to open up the Q&A chat box here. 1 second. Doesn't look like we have any questions coming through. I think the presentation was very informative and clear, so we might not have many questions. I'm just going to ask one, and then if there's no more, then we can close early, because I'm just wondering, what are some of the most common mistakes when researchers are developing budgets for grants? I think you may have mentioned a few of them, but I'm just wondering, yeah, what are those most common mistakes that you see?
Yeah, I can start off discussing just at the application stage when the budgets are being prepared. One of the big common mistakes that we see is investigators starting on the budget a little bit later. With the application, there's a lot of moving parts. There'll be the proposal and other attachments as well, but sometimes the budget is an afterthought almost, that they can kind of put it together at the end. But I think the big thing is to make sure that you are preparing it in advance, and if nothing else, just reaching out to your grants office, because I think that's a big support that they can provide in helping with the budget, and specifically providing the guidance related to the institutional policies, which should be included, and the agency policies as well. Because that's another common mistake as well. Certain items that are included in the budget that should not be included in the budget, and vice versa. That happens a lot, and then we're frantically trying to update the budgets in the end, like just before the deadline. And another common mistake, which seems very small, but we do see it a lot of times, is just that inconsistency between the budget breakdown and the justification. So often we see researchers include the budget, the total dollar amounts within the justification, which is fine, but the only bad thing about that is if the actual dollar amounts in the breakdown is being modified, researchers sometimes forget to go back and update it in the justification. So sometimes it may work well just to include the justification, so the explanation within the justification, unless you've got a detailed breakdown and the dollar amounts are included there. Just keep all the dollar amounts in the breakdown. So if it's in the Excel form, because we do often see inconsistencies or it's calculated incorrectly in the justification. So just those minor details, it happens more often than we'd like.
Okay, great. Sarah, did you have anything to add? Oh, sorry, Priscilla.
I guess well, Sarah focused more on some of the issues that we see when through the budgeting process. So I can kind of highlight some of the things where once you start spending on the project. So once you've got the award, and that I had mentioned that to be aware of your your commitments to your employees. A lot of times as a new researcher, you're hiring employees, you want to be understanding of how long you're hiring them from, and making sure that you have enough funding to support them. As you know, if you don't have enough funding, then HR will have to be involved in that. The other mistake we do see is bringing on students, such as postgraduates or master's students, and some researchers not understanding the amount of commitment that is required for those graduate students. Typically, a master's students would require a 2-year commitment in your research lab, and for PhD students, it could range between 7 to 8 years. We do notice as well that some researchers tend to spend at the beginning very fast, where they spend all their money because they have all this money available, and then later on, when it comes time to they notice that, oh no, we're running out of funds. So just try to moderate and don't overspend, and just keep an eye on your spending.
Okay, perfect. We do have at least a couple of questions in the Q&A box now. So I'll just give you the first one, which is, do you have any advice for setting up financial projection spreadsheets when you have multiple grants from different agencies? Perhaps a separate Excel for each grant, but is there any way to integrate them?
So that depends on, I guess, your financial system in your institution. If we take, for example, the Excel spreadsheet, you can track each grant on its own, each project on its own. And if you wanted to look at a portfolio as a whole, you would combine all the finances together within your whole portfolio. So all of those 3 projects, for example, you would add them all up in your Excel. And I think I had in the template, we've done that a little bit at the bottom. Now, if you have a financial system that allows the capabilities where your grants office would be able to not only track your individual projects separately, but they can review and your finances as a portfolio as a whole. I know at Sick Kids, we do use a business intelligence tool that allows us to see that by PI.
Okay, perfect. I will also ask the next one, which is a bit long, but it's complicated, so I'll read it all out. So it's about the rigidity of grant budgets. You mentioned that you have to stick to the budget, but can you clarify, because some grants, such as the CHR project grant, are not as rigid. And the tri-agency guide has a section on deviation from the proposed budget that says they're not required to be as rigid and they can use it for the broad purpose for what it was awarded. And that people sometimes use these funds for different projects across the lab that fit within the overall theme. So is that accurate? And the second part of the question is, are there any common grants that follow the tri-agency guidelines but do not fit this flexibility? That was a long question. I think you guys can both see the Q&A chat box, so you perhaps can read the question as well. But yeah, any thoughts about that around the rigidity of budgets?
Yeah, I guess I can start off first. So it all depends on the agencies and what their guidelines are in terms of how you are to spend the budget. As you had mentioned, there are some agencies that are a little bit more flexible in how you can spend the money, and some are more rigid. That's where your compliance and reviewing of the terms and conditions come into play. A lot of times when they do award you the award, as Sarah had mentioned, they stipulate their terms and conditions or what their guidelines are and how you can spend it. A lot of, like CIHR or the tri-agency, they give you a set amount of an award, and they give you the flexibility on how you can spend it. They are not as rigid as to your budget categories, whereas NIH is a separate agency and they are more rigid in their budgets in terms of what you applied for and stipulated how you're spending it in each of the budget categories. That is what they're holding you to. So it all depends on agency. I think, Sarah, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, I was just going to add in there that the individual who asked the question is correct. With CIHR, they're a lot more flexible, we've noticed, compared to other agencies, and that I think that's a copy and paste from the TAG fund, the guidelines that they have, that the funding can be used for the broad purpose for which the grant was awarded, which is generally true, but I think it depends for some investigators, and we have some who are involved with diabetes research and cancer research and female research. So they're two very different areas of research, but in general, it's the broad purpose for which the grant was awarded. So if there was a grant for diabetes research, for example, generally you can use the funding for that, but you wouldn't want to. So the comment here is that as long as the projects fit within the overall theme of the lab, in that lab there's two project areas. You don't want to completely use that funding for leukemia research, for example, because that's completely different. That's not what the project was awarded for. But like Priscilla said, each agency is different. So going back to the agency to confirm, and your grants office too, they are experts with the agency. So just confirm with them.
Great. And then there's one last question, and I think we're almost at time, so after that we'll wrap it up. And the question is just, if you have multiple grants, how do you recommend allocating costs that are common to multiple grants, for instance, common supplies?
Mm-hmm. So depending on your institution's policies or what their process is, if they do allow you to allocate the expenditures across two different projects, let's say you have two projects that are using that same supply that you purchased, you can split the cost 50-50. And depending on your accounting office or your grant office, they would be able to do that allocation. Similarly, with your personnel, if you have personnel that are working across maybe 3 different projects and you want to split them out, you can put 33% of their cost on each of those projects. Or if they're working on 4 different projects, you want to allocate 25% of their cost to each of those projects, you can do that as well. Usually, we do recommend trying to allocate your expenses to each project as close as possible to assist with the progress and your use of the finances that you have for those grants.
Awesome. Yep, that makes sense. Sarah, did you have anything else to add, or does that pretty much cover it?
Just at the application stage, I did mention this as well. One thing that we do see some researchers do, especially for those common lab supplies that the entire lab are using, is just to break it down, just allocate the funding per year per FTE. So if you've got a 2-year project that you are preparing the budget for, and you've got maybe 1.5 individuals working on that, so just allocating, if it is an estimated, you'd have to look at what the overall expenses are for those general lab supplies that are being used. If it's maybe $1,500 per FTE per year that's working on the project, and that's sometimes a little bit easier to divide it out between different grants, especially for those common supplies that are being used amongst all of the lab members.
Excellent. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so I think with that, we'll need to wrap it up. Thank you, Sarah and Priscilla, for a great presentation. Before the audience leaves today, I just want to encourage you to fill out the post-event survey, and I'm just dropping the link into the chat for everyone in 1 second here. So the link will be there for you in the chat. And you can suggest future topics for events like this in that survey. And if you're an ECR who's attending today, please also check the save the date for the ECR symposium on our website. With that, thank you again to Sarah and Priscilla and to Sick Kids. And thank you to everyone for attending.